Wouldn't miss our episode 2 today. Very important topics that we need to talk about and get questions on.
Yes. I just want to quickly point to the fact in Bali, just to the audience, that Vanessa sent me a photo of where they were eating dinner one night. All I got to tell you is it looked like it was a 12-story building with a bunch of pools on top. Unbelievable. And I'm jealous. And I hate you for that. But with love. It's love, hate. Is hate love? I'm not sure which one it is, but it's one of those. All right. So today we've got a really interesting topic, and I hope the audience chimes in with questions that we can answer. But today's topic is conquer your fear and unleash your inner warrior. And I want to start really with a question for you, Vanessa, to kind of launch this. And I'm curious from your perspective, and we can trade barbs back and forth, if you will. What is it you are actually fearful of? Like, what is the thing that gets you wound up?
I think probably judgment would be the big piece, would be public judgment.
Yeah.
And, you know, something a lot of people don't know is I am actually a raging introvert, believe it or not, just because and so my big thing has always been public speaking and getting out in front of people. And that's going to surprise some of you on the call that know me because, you know, you've seen me and I do so much public speaking. But I wasn't born like this. And for you know, over a decade in my professional life, the fear of judgment actually had me dreadfully frightened and reacting physically negatively to the thought of being up there on stage and talking to people, or even in group settings. I would just shut down and go silent. So that judgment or people thinking I was rubbish and incompetent is a big fear that I had.
Yeah, there's like an innate, for some people, that innate fear of eyeballs staring at you, right? Like there's something about that, you know, for me, for the most part, there's been examples where that's not true, but that's the only time I feel like I shine is when I'm on stage or I'm doing this. My fears, though, are really laden in I think this sounds ridiculous coming from me, especially if you know my background academically, my inadequacies of my intelligence. And it is so deeply rooted. I think what's interesting, and I'm sure like you and like many people, these fears are really taught behaviors typically when you're growing up. And I was gonna share with Vanessa a story before we started. And so I'd love you to piggyback off this story. But in one of my moments in life where my inadequacies reared their head, I got fired from a job. I always say laid off when I'm talking to a prospective client, but you know, I was fired.
You got shit canned, James.
Yeah. But the story's hilarious.
Yeah,
the story is funny because it was back in 2000, and I was living in San Jose, and at the time, spamware wasn't very good, and so the company was always like, "Hey, don't click on a link you don't know." And of course, being a super curious person, I got an email. I clicked on the link and I shut down 20 of the 21 offices with a virus. And like a week later, I was out the door. Doors were changed. The door locks were changed. So I had what, if anyone watched Seinfeld, I had what is called the Summer of James. And so all I did was teach swim lessons, hike with my dog, and drive down the 805, I think is what it's called, which is the main highway in that area. I think I may got that wrong. Anyhow, I had like 65 and everyone else was going 85 and they just flipped me off. I was so relaxed. It leads me to my story. So when I was teaching swim lessons, I would teach both children and adults. And the fear, this pool was no deeper than 6.5 feet. The fear of these adults was so traumatic, shaking, crying. And you had to deconstruct their fear for them. And often, and so true what I just commented on, my mom said, be scared. Like some version of my mom or dad planted a seed for me around being scared. Yeah. And so with this topic today of really the sense of unleashing your inner warrior, let's start unpacking fear.
Okay.
What does it mean? So from your lens, Vanessa, are there different types of fears, different levels of rationality of fear?
I'll look differently. And I love that acronym, fear, right? False evidence appearing real, which is so true. I mean, if you think about it, if you actually step back and remove the emotion, which clouds our judgment and starts to and exacerbates existing feelings of threat, then you understand that it is very unlikely that that the threat is going to be a big deal. Our fears often are disproportionate to the level of threat that we actually confront. And we know the reason why, right? We know that it is our survival instinct kicking in, telling us that we're going to get chewed up and spat out by the dinosaurs if we don't make a move. But the reality is that these days, it's very unlikely that death or our life is going to be threatened as a result of the fear that we're experiencing. And yet our mind, responds in that way. And I think what's really interesting is to go back to the really fantastic story you told about the kids and the adults. Is it's a very big issue to recognize that a lot of our fears, at least initially, come from our early programming, right?
Yeah.
Come from our parents, what our parents teach us, our parents' fears, cultural, religious, and so on. So interesting, the story about the fear of water, because what's probably likely is that, those children may actually take on the fear of their parents who are afraid of the water. And I see this often, a child who's afraid of bugs at 4. And then you start to unpack the fear of this child that has the fear of bugs at 4, and you recognize as the mum screams blue murder every time she sees a cockroach coming into the house.
Yeah.
So as parents, we have to be very mindful of what we react to and what we're afraid of, and understand that our kids actually take it on by osmosis. And so our past programming is a very big determinant of our fears as adults.
So what I feel like you're saying is you're giving me permission to blame my mom for a lot of my problems. That's what I hear you saying. I mean, that's at least what my therapist tells me as well. So it really works itself out, is all my fears are because of her.
I think, James, we've got to be conscious, and we need to understand what is it that's led me to this place where I'm afraid of X, Y, and Z. And I mean, the example you gave about grades and having a fear of being seen as, not all that bright, believe it or not, I had as a kid as well. And I think it's probably growing up in an ethnic household where the only professions that were respected by my Greek-Italian mother were if you were a doctor or a lawyer.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So if you're a doctor or a lawyer, you were a somebody. But if you were an artist, if you were a creative, if you were a psychologist, this is all very foreign. And so if I didn't go down that route, I didn't have the respect of my parents around my profession. And I actually didn't. I think the most attention I've ever been given by my parents is when I was enrolled in med school, which didn't last because I found out I used to faint at the sight of blood. So that lasted 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So bapow. So I was a disappointment. What am I going to do? Then I got into law school at 17. And I found it really boring because it was so black and white. There was no creativity. And so my father was very proud of me. But after that, all hell broke loose, particularly when I went back to do an arts degree and directed Hamlet in the actors doing Hamlet in the nude. And then I lost all the respect of my parents at that point.
Yeah, you jumped off the rails at that point to your family.
I was off the rails, right? Totally off the rails. But it has big impact.
So let's talk about the notion of we have personal fears, right? And then we have our professional fears. And you and I both work. I mean, I deal with my children's irrational fears all the time. I'm sure you deal with yours. But if we fast forward that to the adults in the working world and organizations, what are some common fears that you see with the leaders you work with? And and I have a couple stories, but I'd love to hear just like 1 or 2 anecdotes from your perspective.
Oh, look, probably the biggest one is looking incompetent. And I really get it, right? Looking stupid, looking incompetent, looking like
imposter syndrome is a big one.
Imposter syndrome, that big one. And just waiting for that day when someone will come and tap you on the shoulder and realize that you're not as good as they thought you were and it's time to move you along, right? That's a big waiting for that tap on the shoulder and be busted. You're actually not all that bright. You suck. You're not a great professional is what I hear a lot of the time. And what I've understood is the reason for this is, and I'm right there, right, is we've been trained as experts, many of us. We've been trained, particularly in the technical occupations. I think we probably suffer even the most in that because we're trained in absolutes early on. And that's where we get our power from. That's where we get our personal power from, and our professional power is being able to say yes or no, black or white. And that's not actually the reality of life,
So much gray.
Learn to dance is so much gray. I talk about learning to dance in ambiguity, but technical professionals have an absolute morbid fear of being found out as not all that clever because that's where they get their confidence from, which is shaky at best, right? So there's the work around fear. If your confidence is shaky because you judge your worth and your value based on what you know, not who you are, then it's always going to be shaky.
Yeah, but I always feel like, for myself at least, like just from an audience perspective, is to kind of give context on my background. I have a PhD from University of Western Australia, super fortunate to be there, have a master's from there, I have an MBA, but I barely got out of university. And I found out late in life that I had a form of dyslexia, right? So why I can't get words right in my head, I've got to write things down. I've got to rewrite them and look at them because I'll remember them wrong in my head. And so the training, the fear conditioning that I got again and again is you're going to go study. You're not going to remember anything. You're going to get a C on the test. And you're going to do it again. You're going to do it again. Or I'm going to get a 50 on the test if I speak more in Australian vernacular for grades. And so my conditioning for that is I am dumb. I am not smart. My friends do the same thing. They're getting, 80s and 90s, not me. And so what happens is that you couple that with a dad who was very domineering and very hierarchical.
Yeah.
Put me in a room with grown men, and I tend to not want to have a strong opinion. I tend not to want to take risks. I tend to defer a lot. And this is coming from a grown ass man who's nearly 50, right? Yeah. And you still have it. And so I can imagine in corporate world, there is so much baggage from that fear conditioning. And, I'm really curious, how do we as human beings, because, when you have fear, it's a different chemical firing in your brain, right? So it's a very fixed mindset. So we bring in Carol Dweck, a very fixed mindset. How do we then use these fears to become our inner warrior? How do we shift from fixed to growth on a fear that seems so irrational at times? To your point, to the acronym, it's all there. It's in the acronym. Is there any evidence of this? You would look at my stupid degrees that don't mean anything.
Yeah.
You would think, what the F? Why would this guy think this way? So, yeah.
So you've got to outwork your fear, right?
Yeah.
You got to outwork your fear. You've got to mirror your fear with equal parts courage. And the way you do that is actually, the way you do that is actually through quite a logical process. Okay. So the first thing that we need to think about is where is this coming from? Is actually stop and take some time for reflection, which is superpower it's like your super muscle, right? And say, what's actually going on for me right now? Why am I becoming a baby, becoming a child in the presence of grown men?
Yeah.
Right? What the hell? Why am I this wilting like a little flower?
And I get pissed every time. I get so angry about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel that because, in the presence of your dad, you were shut down. So you were conditioned not to have a voice. You went, Bop, right? And so, but you're not there anymore. Here's the bottom. You're actually not there anymore. You're not him anymore. You're a grown-ass man. He's not in the room with you, right?
Yeah.
So first place is to recognize what is happening here. Who am I with? Who am I?
Yeah.
And it's not the same scenario. It's almost maladaptive behavior. And can I give you an example? No,
Yeah,
no,
please.
maladaptive. You're abnormal,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Not really. It's actually quite normal. But when you understand it, it makes sense. So I want you to imagine, when I go to the States, I'm used to driving, in Australia on the other side of the road.
Yeah.
I go to the States and I sit behind the wheel and it's on completely the other side and I have a meltdown.
Yeah.
I start driving and I'm veering all over. It's maladaptive.
Yeah.
I don't drive on the correct side of the road when I'm in the States. I go to the Australian side of the road.
Sure.
Okay. So this is what's happening to you in those moments. Your brain is firing still on the old side of the road.
Yeah.
You actually haven't adapted your mindset to where you are now. It hasn't caught up with you. You haven't necessarily done the work to bring you to the new you, which is the person, the grown-ass, successful, capable man you are today.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's what's happening. So you can see that that's the first place, is we have to outwork that fear and actually deconstruct it and pull it apart to recognize how far we've come. So that's the first place. The second thing we need to do is we need to argue with ourselves and say, hey, man, what is the evidence that I have of me being successful when I am engaging with older men, for example? When have I actually turned this around and being a real kick-ass, being a real warrior? And you find the evidence to show to yourself that you actually know what you're doing, because you do, and I have faith in you.
Yeah.
So you outwork the fear that way by finding the evidence which is stronger than the fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what you're really saying is you're looking for those moments to disprove your fear. You're looking for moments of excellence.
Correct.
That have occurred, and say, wait a second, whatever this fear is over here, and this could be anybody, right? What evidence do you have in the last 2 weeks, 6 months, year, that that's actually true about your behavior? Because we're talking about, often fear manifests itself in behaviors, right?
Yes,
so how are we seen? How do we act? What words do we choose? And I think that for me, and I think for many executives, first of all, let's also back up. Imposter syndrome then is something you fight against at the same time. So if you have any other of these challenges, and if we take the appreciative inquiry perspective, opportunities to flip those around, to figure out, like, Carrie, when you text on the side, I can't do both. My brain just farts. I have no idea what I was saying. I'm such a guy. Our wizard in the back texts something on the side, and I read it, and then I just totally forget my thoughts. Damn it.
I just wanted to step into that, James. Could I just step into that? So I want to give a really salient and tangible example to everybody listening, and then we want to hear from you. Like, what are some of the fears holding you back? I want to give a really good example. So I talked earlier, and when we started the episode today, about the fact that I actually used to be crippled by anxiety every time I used to go on the stage or public speaking. So how did I overcome that? Look, I'm not saying I still don't have fear when I show up, but what I do is, rather than saying I suck at public speaking, or I'm not really good at speaking in groups, or nobody wants to hear from me, I go back, I say, okay, how did you do last time? What was the reaction of the audience last time you got up and spoke? Oh, well, I got a standing ovation. All right. Sucked in, Vanessa. There's nothing to tell you that you are going to suck today, because last time you spoke in front of the audience, you actually had people crying and you ended up leaving the stage with a standing ovation. Do you see what I'm doing, everybody? What is the evidence to disprove my fear? And it's real evidence that helps me. It's like building your self-confidence, or, having a bad day, to tell yourself that you're great by looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, oh, yeah, Vanessa, you're so great. Woo! Positive affirmations. That's not how you outwork the fear. You outwork the fear by thinking about all the examples of where people that love you, who think you're great, to actually use real evidence and examples to say, you know what, this isn't just a pie in the sky thought. I'm not just looking at myself in the mirror or writing you're great with my lipstick. Actually, I've got lots of evidence to tell me that I am. So I'm gonna draw from that.
But I was gonna. So first of all, those who are listening, please put your fear in there. The other thing I want to know, and I have a question or a comment back to you, and that's, is we were talking about imposter syndromes. I'd love to know if the audience just put their hand up or a heart or whatever interaction. I'm not sure what can happen on your end, but let's go with hearts that people feel that they have imposter syndrome. I would love, from a psychology perspective, genderize that, race, figure out, but I bet there's some really interesting findings. But I was thinking about the notion, we keep going back to this inner warrior, and you specifically, but I think that for others on a more macro level, it becomes your anxiety about speaking becomes your warrior because you prepare yourself so much that you don't give yourself an opportunity to fall short of the expectations. Correct. And then you get the affirmation at the end of that by the standing ovation and the tears and that. Because I think that's a powerful driver, intrinsic motivation. Because I would also unpack that and say it's probably shame. Fear of shame, fear of, all of those get kind of wrapped up. When we think about in a corporate setting, how should someone in a corporate setting begin to unpack fear and lean into these micro moments to challenge that fear, to work it, if you will, to the other side?
I think feedback is a really powerful way to overcome fear. I ran the retreat, as I mentioned, for 4 days in Bali this week, and it was really interesting. We ran a feed forward activity where I get people to walk around and say, I need help with this particular behavior. Could you give me an idea of how I might overcome it? And then the response has to be, when you get the feedback, thank you, and treat it as a gift, and then you shut the hell up. You shut up and listen. And it was really powerful to watch the impact on the executive team getting this feedback around what they perceived to be areas that they needed to work on. The predominant feedback from the team after we conducted the feed forward activity was, I actually realized that how hard I am on myself. And actually the very behavior or the thing that I thought I sucked in wasn't an issue for anybody else but me. So feedback, James, is such a powerful way to test your theory.
Well, I actually like the way you say it's feed forward. To me is way more impact. Feedback to me is, when organizations do this, and it really pisses me off, because what it does from a fear perspective is it re-anchors that person to the one thing they're probably scared of.
Correct.
And so, to say what I'm not doing well, again, is that fixed mindset. So to say what you would love to see different is opening and full of abundance. And I think that difference in terms of trying to tackle something you're fearful of, and trying to unleash, if you will, like this inner warrior to lean into that. Because I know for me and people I've worked with, until they deal with the fear, often that fear holds them back from accelerating whatever it is, whatever objective they have or goal they have or vision they have of themselves. It ends up being almost their personal airbag. They keep hitting it and the airbag goes off, I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, look, I think it's always there. That's why it so helps when we get the perspective of others, because it helps to ground us in the reality of how we're actually performing or coming across. We can we too easily get out the, of Catholic guilt. We get out that whip and we start self-flagellating, and particularly women as well. And I don't want to make it a gender thing, but women tend to be very hard on themselves, in fact, more hard than men. So the research says, this isn't me talking, this is the research thing. Women can be particularly hard on themselves, and just recognizing, the truth of how they're performing, how they're showing up, where they're strong, what their impact is, and, and trying to recreate those moments of greatness, which can only happen if we get really good live feedback on how we're actually doing in the workplace, which is why shadow coaching is so powerful as a technique. So I use shadow coaching. I don't know if you're familiar with it, James.
No.
So shadow coaching is just this fantastic coaching work that I do, where I actually essentially follow someone around for a week, and they pay me to follow them around for a week, and I'm with them in every meeting, in every situation, and it's coaching in real time, so that I can be there as a mirror, if you will, to that person as they're walking around on their daily job in the teams, etc. And as they're doing amazing things, give them some feedback so that they're able to recreate those great moments. And my focus is, as a positive psychologist, recreating those great moments, showing them how they're actually pushing through their fears, giving them loads of evidence and examples to actually bolster up their self-image and their self-worth so that they come back far stronger. And it's almost like appreciative inquiry coaching in real time. Very, very powerful. Much like your Q Change app and business that you started.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the premise of that, and we were actually before I left, moving to a feed forward, not a feedback model. That's where we were heading technology wise. Yeah. The goal of that was getting that real time perception of how you showed up and how people perceived you. And often it was, people perceived you better than you perceived yourself. That was often the gap. It was never, I rated myself higher than the team rated me. It was always the other way around.
But we don't ask, do we, James? We don't ask.
We're not given opportunities
too. The failing I see of leaders that I work with is they do not ask for feedback. They don't ask.
Well, they're worried about what they're going to get response on. I mean, that's
correct. And so what is really going on? In order to get over your fears, in order to empower yourself, we have to lose the ego. Yeah. Ego is playing a big role in stopping us from asking, right? You may be surprised what you hear when you actually ask, and I mean to the positive.
Yeah. Well, you know, the framing, and we gotta land this plane. But the framing I love to tell people is, what do you love and what would you love to see different? Right. So both of those are giving you what you're doing great and the opportunities to strengthen whatever it is or gaps you might have. Vanessa, just one last question for you. What is one thing that you could recommend someone do today to start working on something that might be holding them back from a fear perspective?
Yeah, I love that question. Thanks, James. Is to identify all of those things that scare you senseless, and I'm trying to be polite here, and actually use the technique that I suggested today. Pull it apart and say, well, what is the rationality behind this fear? What has driven it? Is it past programming? Is it because I've had a bad experience? Am I still there or have I moved on? And then to collect all the evidence to the contrary so that you move your mind from emotion to rationality around the fear. And that'll start the step in a new direction. Remember, I said you've got to outwork your fear by finding the evidence to the contrary. You've got this.
Awesome. So, hey, as we wrap, I've clearly mentioned our sponsors. One sponsor would be the Vanessa Vershaw Group, as one of the sponsors of this show, Ambitious Minds. Listen, if you're interested in learning more about Vanessa and I and what we do, please check out our websites. Vanessa's is being redone, but it's Reinvention Consulting. I got that right?
.com.au.
Yeah. And mine is just drjameskelly.com, Keley. If you're interested in our books, Vanessa's just launched her Unreasonably Ambitious book. She's written Bitch Fight, and I've got mine, which is called The Crucible's Gift, 5 Lessons from Authentic Leaders That Thrive in Adversity. That's our advertisement for today. That's it. We're done. I want to say thank you to everybody that showed up. Next week's episode is 5 brain hacks to amplify your resilience. I forgot to put hacks in this, and I wrote 5 brain to amplify your resilience, which would make no sense. So 5 brain hacks to amplify your resilience. Thank you to everybody who was here today. If any of your friends weren't here, think they should come and check it out. Please spread the word to everybody out there. Thank you. Have a wonderful week. I want 5 brains.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye from Bali. Thank you, Dr. J. And we'll see you next week. And we're going to be going in depth to those 5 brain hacks to build mental agility in a crazy VUCA with an extra A accelerated world. See you next week. Bye, everybody. Ciao.